Thank you for attending my talk entitled Building Linguacultural Competence into a Business English Textbook. My name is Lucas Peltonen, and I'm a PhD student at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Today, I have a general question, which is how can we improve the linguacultural competency of business English speakers? So more specifically, how can we adjust materials to reflect the reality of business English as a lingua franca communication, particularly focusing on linguacultural competencies? So I wanted to offer an intended solution to the above questions. I use a research-based criteria to analyze the market leader textbook to determine how it could be adapted to better develop linguacultural competencies. Today's agenda will be a brief self-introduction, and then I'll go over the state of English and business English. Then I'll offer the project's process theory and findings, and finally have some material and teaching adaptations for the classroom. After that, there can be a Q&A. You can email me your questions. So here's a brief self-introduction, my background as it relates to this study. Here are some of the companies I worked with in southern China. It's my experience with these professionals that informs my research, as I saw their strengths and weaknesses and noticed that there was a pattern of miscommunication that might be attributable to culture. Now, let's go over the state of English and business English, talk about some facts, trends, and changes. There's a lot of information here talking about English in the world today. The overall theme is changes. I wanted to focus on the bottom where it says, therefore, because the nature of English in the world is changing, teaching and learning should change to reflect the new realities of international communication. Talking about business English in China, again, there's a lot of information here, but I want to focus at the bottom on textbooks. Textbooks are widely used in Chinese business English teaching and learning, though many or even most of these textbooks have been created in Anglophone countries and reflect Anglo-American perspectives and cultural orientations. Now let's look more closely at this project. Why did I focus on the market leader textbook? There are 4 reasons. First of all, it's aimed at active job experience business professionals, which is an under-researched group. Also, according to Rose and Galloway's Global Englishes for Language Teaching Framework, GELT framework, within which my research functions, it ranked by far the highest in its global orientation. Also, as we will see, it compares strongly against 4 other major global English textbooks. And finally, I have great experience with it, so I know how it works within the classroom and have ideas about how to adapt it. In terms of the process of this study, first I developed a conceptual framework from research literature. From that, I created criterias, can-dos from the research framework, plus interviews and questionnaires with professionals. With the criteria in place, I did quantitative and qualitative analysis and evaluation according to the criteria. And finally, based on all of that, I adapted market leader based on the materials analysis and evaluation. From a theoretical perspective, it's important to place my research within the GELT framework. Global Englishes, as defined by Rose and Galloway, is an inclusive paradigm looking at the linguistic, socio-linguistic, and socio-cultural diversity and fluidity of English use and English users in a globalized world. And so it's within this theoretical framework that my studies LCC framework, my studies linguacultural competency framework, addressing the linguacultural aspects of GELT functions. There are many components to the GELT framework. My research functions within 2 of them. The first is the concept of target culture, because in traditional ELT, target culture would be a static native English-speaking culture, but in GELT, it's fluid cultures. And then there's the concept of other languages and cultures. So in traditional ELT, other languages and cultures would be seen as a hindrance and source of interference, but in GELT, these are seen as a resource, as with all other languages in their linguistic repertoire. After a really deep dive into the research literature, I developed my conceptual framework, which I call the LCC framework, the Linguacultural Competency Framework. It has as you can see here, it has a tripartite structure moving from broad to more specific. The components are Belf theory, which provides the characteristics and context of international business communication. After that, on a more specific level, is linguacultural theory, which shows how language and culture intermix within interactions. And most specifically is genre theory, which defines and structures the communication that must be known within the cultures of business. And from this framework, I developed the criteria, which I said before are can-dos, with which to analyze business English textbooks. And by can-dos, I mean, for example, professionals can, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't enough to just analyze according to criteria from research. I needed to check with the professionals. So I performed 14 semi-structured interviews with active business professionals across China. And from that, I developed a questionnaire completed by 108 business professionals across 14 industries. And combining the research findings and the interviews and questionnaires, I settled on 20 final criteria. Combining the research criteria with what I found during the surveys, as I said before, I settled on 20 criteria. 14 of the criteria were from research that were supported by the professionals, and those are in purple. There were also 4 new criteria that arose from the interviews and questionnaires I performed. Those are here in red. There were 2 pairs of criteria that I combined together. Those are in green. And 1 criterion was not supported. That one is crossed out in black on the left-hand side. As this was a mixed methods investigation, I first will go into the quantitative findings, and after that, I'll go into the qualitative findings and then how they combine. So I began the study by analyzing 5 major business English textbooks so that I knew the entire landscape of global business English textbooks and could select a textbook based on data. And you can see here that the textbooks were quite similar in profile, though Market Leader on the left had a higher overall incidence of linguacultural building opportunities. Notably, the ratios of linguacultural building opportunities that were missed and present were quite similar across the books. As you can see, missed opportunities ranged from 14% to about 20%. So actually, the books ended up being quite similar. This is a focus on Market Leader, focusing on the units. I analyzed the opportunities unit by unit and chose unit 3 because it had a relatively high number of opportunities overall and a balance between missed and present opportunities. So drilling down on unit 3, as we saw, the competencies present and absent were almost totally balanced, which I thought would provide a good opportunity for qualitative analysis with lots of opportunities to see how they were present and absent. I also analyzed unit 3 according to the criteria, just to get a profile of which criteria were present and which were absent. Finally, I wanted to determine what types of genres were present. Transactional, which is the task-focused communication of getting the job done, or interpersonal communication, which is developing rapport and relationships for business purposes. And as we can see, this unit had 100% transactional genres. And from there, with the quantitative information in place, it was time to take a qualitative look at unit 3 more closely. In fact, there were a lot of findings, but I will highlight a few interesting ones now. First of all, there was no presence of cultural theories such as those relating to cultural dimensions like individualism versus collectivism. That's unlike other textbooks that did provide insight into these theories as ways of structuring understanding of culture in business. The representation of cultures were strongest in 2 areas, corporate and regional, though regional was problematically characterized as national. And I say problematic because often multiple linguacultures are present within a nation's boundaries, and these linguacultures might spill outside of the nations also. Genres were 100% transactional, mismatching survey results in which a majority of respondents said interpersonal communication is at least 50% of their interactions. So that illustrates a tremendous mismatch between what business professionals need and what the unit presented. And finally, I noticed an absence of religion, even in terms of holiday schedules, work weeks, or food in this unit, and in fact, across all textbooks. And I included this because 2 of the interviewees highlighted the importance of understanding how religion impacts business, such as countries with different weekend, weekday schedules, holiday practices, and calendars. As an example, let's take a look at small pieces of Unit 3's starting up section, which is at the beginning of the unit, and the case study section, which is at the end of the unit. The case study is about a merger between an Australian and Hong Kong company. I highlighted some questions in the starting up section and a complaint in the case study section. Now, these are about a merger. Question 2 says you keep your job after a merger, but you are in a less powerful position. And question 3 says you keep your job after a merger, but you have to take a salary cut. And then if we go to the bottom, looking at the case study quote, it says most of the management jobs have been given to Australians. There are not many Chinese in senior positions. Everyone's complaining about it. So this is about a merger affecting power structures and individuals within an organization. And so I applied my criteria number 7 to it, which says professionals can understand, accept, and communicate according to different cultural concepts of power and management organization in the workplace. So while these exercises offer an opportunity to build criteria 7's competency, they do not explicitly do so. So the question is, what can we do to develop this competency? And so here are some pedagogical options to address building criteria 7's competency, and they're sort of organized by category. First, on the left, you can see self-reflection, as in the starting up questions. They could encourage students to consider their own thoughts by writing journals or participating in a discussion. Another pedagogical option is to build knowledge, such as presenting cultural dimensions, such as power distance in the workplace. But it's very important to note that cultural dimensions must be viewed flexibly. And so that's why I put positioning theory, because it's context dependent that will determine how the cultural dimensions function. And finally, the students could practice flexibility within the changing management structures. And we could do that using role plays and strategy charts to guide communication. So there we are. We went from theory to surveying professionals to building criteria, analyzing a textbook, and finding adaptations to address our questions about linguacultural competency building. Some key takeaways and next steps are, how can we, well, we go back to the basic question, how can we improve the linguacultural competency of active job experienced professionals? Because if the nature of English language communication in the world is changing, teaching and learning must evolve to reflect such changes. The LCC framework drew theoretical support for the investigation, which was then supported by the surveys of active business professionals. And a quantitative and qualitative analysis informed adjustments made to the textbook. But I did want to note that each teaching and learning situation is different. So the materials adaptations would be different according to individual teachers and their learners' requirements. So even if you look at these exact same materials and use the exact same criteria, different practitioners will come to different conclusions because each context is quite different. And next steps will be for me to test these adaptations in the classroom. So thank you for joining. Here are the references. And now it is time to welcome your questions.